Our third speaker comes to us from New Zealand, that when you're in New Zealand, you say Aotearoa. And Dr. Lisa Te Morenga comes to us from the University of Otago. And she is a senior research fellow in human nutrition and associate dean of the Māori component of the Division of Sciences. This is the Department of Human Nutrition at the University of Otago, and her research interests involve the role of diet in the treatment and prevention of obesity, the metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. She has a special title here for you, and I urge you to look not only at the abstract for her presentation, but also her impressive background abstract that's in your program. Her title is A Whakapapa Māori Co-Design Approach for Developing a Healthy Lifestyle Support Tool for Use in New Zealand Māori Communities. Please welcome Lisa.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi ki ngā tangata o Shokapē, Metawakan Tān Sioux community. Tēnei te mihi ki Mindy Kersner. Tēnei te mihi ki ngā rangatira o ngā huewha. Everyone here, greetings. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So just to start with, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about who I am, ko wai'o. I whakapapa to 3 New Zealand iwi or tribes. I've circled them at the top of New Zealand there, so Ngāpuhi, Te Rarawa and Ngāti Whātua are my iwi, and on the top there you'll see images of one of my maunga, my mountain, and my moana, or my sea, which is the Kaipara Harbour, and Tukutuka, the mountain. And on the right there is my beautiful wharenui at a marae kohewhata. However, I actually live way down south at the bottom there in a town called Dunedin, which is also a very beautiful country, and that's where I work at the University of Otago, and I've just put a little picture there of my 3 guys that I live with down there, Steve, Oscar and Henry. I think I probably do win the prize for coming the furthest distance, because Debbie, who spoke to you yesterday, actually comes from somewhere near the top of the North Island there. So for me, it was a 2-hour flight just to get to Auckland, to get to the plane, to get to LA, and then on to Minnesota. But a couple of months ago, I went to Croatia, and that took me 50 hours door to door. So actually, I don't feel like I've come all that far. So just a bit of background, you may or may not be aware that New Zealand's founding document is called Dietary or Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, and it was signed in 1840 by the British Crown and chiefs of most of the Māori tribes in New Zealand. It was a document where the Māori tribes ceded sovereignty to the Crown, but in return were guaranteed the right to determine their own affairs, run their own, make decisions regarding their own land and water and resources, and were guaranteed the rights and privileges of British citizens. However, as we have a fairly similar history to Native peoples here, in that treaty, at least we had one, hasn't been well honoured over the period since it was signed, and we've seen pervasive land confiscation, the loss of our mātauranga or Māori knowledge systems and our resources, destabilising of our socio-political organisations. Of course, we have a history of racism and discrimination, which continues today, although probably to a lesser extent than perhaps you see here in the States. That loss of access to traditional food sources for many Māori, policies of deliberate exclusion from higher education until the 1970s, despite having the apparent rights of British citizens. So in my dad's generation, they were trained, they were actively encouraged not to go into tertiary education, but to become our workers, shepherds, farmers, well, farm hands really, labourers, service workers, those sorts of things. And then in the 80s, with our neoliberal politics, when we saw a massive sort of loss in public service jobs, those people, our people, were disproportionately affected by those harms as well. And as a result, our health has perhaps fallen to even worse levels, or continues to be worse than that of the general population in New Zealand. So here's just some evidence, some data showing the obesity prevalence in our Māori population over the last 10 years or so, and you can see that we're nearly up to 50% of our Māori adults being obese here. And corresponding with those high obesity rates, we have very high, or relatively high rates of diagnosed and undiagnosed diabetes, close to 10%. The general population would be closer to 6%, although our Pacific Island population in New Zealand would be up around 15 or 16%. Very high rates of prediabetes there, and cardiovascular disease. And compared with non-Māori, non-Pacific New Zealanders, we're 2 times more likely to die from heart disease, 1.5 times more likely to die from stroke, and 2 times more likely to have diabetes. And just to remind you, I guess, that the obesity is really caused by social determinants, I guess, of obesity. And you can see here explaining that disparity. I should say the general population, the obesity rate in New Zealand in adults is about 28%, so we're nearly double that rate. You can see here that we're just less educated, more likely to live in poverty, have lower incomes, more likely to be unemployed, and have low home ownership rates. And that is reflected in poorer dietary patterns, resulting in this higher rate of diabetes here. So a survey, and we have a national nutrition survey. The last one was done about 10 years ago, and unfortunately I don't think we're due to have another one under the current government. But we saw that Māori were much less likely to report consuming 5 fruits and vegetables a day, less likely to choose low-fat foods and whole grain breads, and more likely to consume fast foods, junk foods, sugary drinks, fish and chips. It's not all bad in New Zealand, though, and these health inequities, the disparities, are very well recognised by our Ministry of Health, so that's our government-funded health organisation. I should just point out and remind you, I guess, that we're a very small country, so our population is only 4.8 million, so I guess we'd be the size of a small state here. It's possibly a little bit easier to run a country when you're that little. But this is an example, I think, of where Māori have been able to colonise our non-Māori population a little, in that our Ministry of Health, its activities are really underpinned by the key principles of our Treaty of Waitangi. So those are partnership, participation and protection, and those principles are enacted to ensure the well-being of all peoples, Māori and non-Māori. And it underpins a large number of strategies put in place to improve outcomes for Māori, reduce inequalities, allow Māori to have self-determination over their health, to be active participants in health decisions and also as health providers, looking at new ways, encouraging organisations in New Zealand to look at more effective modes of health delivery for our Māori communities, and looking to develop the capacities in our communities. So I think that's a really nice thing. And I think we're starting to make some gains, although we still have a lot to catch up on. The other great thing I think about in New Zealand is that our research funding organisations have, at their core, they fund research. They now require that research that is funded in New Zealand is responsive to the needs of Māori. So this is one of our big research funds by a government organisation, and you can see here they list some requirements of research. All research should be able to demonstrate some benefit to Māori, and some of the things they really emphasise wanting to see are research projects around Indigenous innovation, so trying to drive economic growth in New Zealand through taking advantage, Māori being able to take advantage of Māori knowledge systems, environment, mental research that's based on mātauranga or Māori understandings of land systems and management, health research that improves health and social well-being of Māori and non-Māori, that sort of thing. And then our Health Research Council, which is where I would get most of my research from, so they fund the majority of health research in New Zealand. They have a lot of documents here talking about how research we don't want to fund research in New Zealand that's going to increase health inequities. So everyone who submits a research proposal to the Health Research Council, and I think they fund it up to $100 million a year in research, they have to be able to demonstrate that they have considered whether this research is going to increase inequities or not, and what they can do to ensure that Māori are going to benefit from the research. Ideally, I think there will be favouritism for good quality research that targets Māori or Pacific communities here. So you can look at my slides if you want to read this information in more detail. In fact, with the Health Research Council, we actually have a dedicated Māori research panel where there is a ring-fenced amount of money. I think it's $7 to $10 million a year, which is specifically for Māori-led research. So research that's responsive to Māori will, as I said before, identify how we'll benefit from it. It must include the appropriate Māori voices and expertise. You need to show that you've consulted with the right communities and the right people. Ideally, it will imply Māori engagement methods and research principles. It will identify specific and agreed roles for Māori communities, researchers, and responsibilities for those. They don't just want token names, which, being a Māori researcher, I do find people wanting to collaborate with me all the time to get my name on a research proposal, which can be good and bad. Need to have a research dissemination plan, sort of show how you're going to ensure that Māori communities benefit from the knowledge that's generated from your research, and also has to identify any risks that might be there for Māori communities, such as genomics or genealogical research, as we've had done in the past, which can be quite negative. I don't know if you heard, but maybe 10 years ago, we had a dodgy group of researchers in New Zealand that took some Māori-owned tribal genetic data and identified a so-called warrior gene and produced some research without the approval of the tribes whose data that came from, claiming that Māori were predisposed to violence. And it was very poor research as well. But fortunately, that's a very notorious story in New Zealand. We have a lot of people working to avoid that sort of travesty from happening in the future. Anyway, before I get on to talking about the topic of my research, which was a mHealth program that we've been working on, I thought it might be interesting for you to just hear a little bit about a really positive diabetes prevention program that was a participatory community-led diabetes project conducted in the east coast of New Zealand amongst the Ngati iwi. So the east coast, also known as Tairawhiti. And that was called Ngati and Healthy, and it ran until about 2006, so it's a bit out of date now. It's been quite a long time ago, but so diabetes in Tairawhiti before this intervention was some of the worst diabetes rates that we see in our country. And that region is also a region which has the highest density of Māori, or the highest proportion of Māori living in that area. A lot of people still living on their tribal lands, living relatively rural lives here. And so you could see amongst our older people here that diabetes prevalence was up to about a third of older adults there, and a very high rate of insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. So a group of concerned Māori health providers, community workers, and community health workers contacted our colleagues in Otago University to get together to develop a research program to tackle these high rates of diabetes. They spent a lot of time at the outset building the relationship between the academics, the community, and the health workers before putting a proposal together. Did wide consultation with the community, trying to identify the barriers to accessing the research program and things that might enhance or discourage people from participating in it. And they designed their project to use community resources to increase the accessibility of the intervention activities in this area. Regular feedback was always given to the community through appropriate communication styles. So they would hold hui, or meetings, on marae, our tribal houses. I showed you my one on the first slide, and where community would come and hear about the work that they were doing. And they tried to create a very supportive environment with the right people to facilitate individuals in those communities to adopt healthier lifestyles. Based on a survey prior to the research, the objectives of this Ngati and Healthy program were very similar actually to international research around what Tiffany spoke about, the sorts of things that we know will work. So just a modest weight loss, 5 to 10% of initial weight, through increased physical activity, and also trying to increase intakes of whole grain cereals, vegetables and fruit, which were very low in the community before that, and reducing intake of energy-dense foods high in fat and sugar. The community developed their own resources using pictures of their own people to spread these messages to the community, and they developed these funny little posters which might look a little bit hokey to you, but this was their East Coast rugby team, which were kind of heroes, maybe like, was it the Vikings here or something in Minnesota? And they had a lot of problem with these posters getting pinched by the local kids who thought they were really good, so they had lots of posters like that. And they had community exercise classes, cooking classes, all sorts of things run by local people, or kaiawhina we might call them, who lived on the coast, knew the community and could really get them activated. And it was successful. So in the 2 or 3 years that it was running, we saw insulin resistance prevalence in that community decreased from 36% to 25%. The diabetes prevalence decreased slightly, and that was significant. And the proportion of the community that were achieving the exercise goals increased, and the number of people choosing whole grain bread increased too. And this was achieved actually by targeting the shops that the people would be purchasing their food from. So they lived in this rural community. They didn't have access to supermarkets very easily. They'd have to travel 2 or 3 hours on windy roads to get to the largest town. So they were dependent on small stores, and they were able to get the storekeepers to change the type of bread which previously wasn't available in that community. Oops, I'll go back. So this was a successful program. By all accounts, the community loved it. Unfortunately, it wasn't evaluated using a randomised controlled trial because it's very difficult to do that in a community-led intervention. And also there's a strong belief in our communities that if you think something's going to work, then why shouldn't everyone benefit from that intervention? So they didn't want to have a randomised control trial where people weren't going to be getting the best advice. And that probably wasn't good enough for our research funders. And so even though the community loves it, there were some apparent benefits, that program did not translate into a change to funding, so that all those supports that were put in place as a result of research, once the research program was finished, were taken away from the community, and they're basically left to fend for themselves. So the communities up there, I still go up there, they still talk very fondly of Ngati and Healthy and what they can do to try and get these kaiwhina positions supported, but we're not yet successful. So we are trying to look at other ways that we can develop interventions targeting our communities that will be more sustainable and don't rely on the government funding positions or people in the communities to support our communities to healthier lifestyles. So I've been part of a research program looking at developing a mobile health tool targeting Māori and Pacific communities, and with the objective of trying to reduce this high prevalence of diabetes and obesity in those communities. This has been a very collaborative research project involving Toi Tangata, a Māori health provider, and some in their local communities that they work with, and a Pacific health provider called the Whānau and Pacific Islands Community Services Trust in South Waikato, as well as university researchers here. So the aim was to design and evaluate a culturally tailored, personalised M-Health lifestyle support program for Māori and Pacifica communities. It's almost a kaupapa Māori research project, but not quite, because we got the funding for this project a little bit ahead of doing the consultation, and some of the parameters of the research are set in place as a result of the funder not wanting to fund us without having some specified parameters there. But it's almost kaupapa Māori research. The original concept, I'll just describe M-Health for those who don't know you. So M-Health refers to medical and public health practice which is supported by mobile devices such as mobile phones, patient monitoring devices, or personal digital assistants, PDAs, and other wireless devices. And this definition was actually created by the World Health Organization in 2006, and it sort of reflects how quickly this area is growing, because personal digital assistants I don't think are around anymore at all. And anyway, so the original idea was probably to develop a text-based simple support tool. Previous research done by my collaborators had shown in our low-income populations that very simple text reminders were quite effective at supporting healthier lifestyle changes, such as to give up smoking, or they have a blood glucose monitoring text service for people with diabetes, which is quite effective, and also one for pregnant mothers, encouraging them to, or supporting them to make healthier food choices. And the text system was thought at that time to be more, probably likely to be more helpful for our communities, because data can be expensive and a lot of people don't have their own phone, and so they might just have very simple phones that can receive text. Also, it's quite easy to respond to a text, you don't have to open anything up. So we went into this thinking we might develop a text-based program, but because we wanted to do very participatory research, we decided that we weren't going to limit ourselves. We were going to find out what the community thought would work for them first, and also to find out really what the community felt they needed support with. So we didn't even want to really emphasise diabetes or obesity promotion. We wanted to find out from our communities what they felt were the biggest issues for them in terms of health. So we use this co-design process, which Debbie talked about yesterday. So co-design is a research process where we bring together designers and people not trained in design, such as researchers and community people, to work together to design and develop some sort of tool or service or product. So we were looking to develop some sort of service, health service. Getting started took quite a long time to get this program off the ground, because building relationships and the sort of community research is of the utmost importance. So we had to bring together the right people. We worked with community health providers, and they had to bring together their communities that they felt they could work with and who would be interested in working with us. And we had to, as a research team, get to know ourselves. So we went through a long process of whakawhanaungatanga, which is building our relationships, establishing a set of values and procedures for the way we would work together in the future, which I've just described here. And then it took about 6 months to get that going, and then once our community research leaders were convinced that the academic team really understood and were on the same page as them, only then we were allowed to go off into the community to meet with them and to start talking about what they wanted. So we held a number of hui and whānau with different community groups. Thank you. Asking our communities what health and well-being means to them, what their hopes and dreams for whānau were, what some of the barriers to achieving those hopes and dreams would be, and what sort of mobile tools might help them support their well-being. And we used a very creative process there, getting Play-Doh and lots of tools and things for our community to create structures or stories around and communicate their ideas to us. In trying to get our community to talk to us, we have this fabulous young community research leader who's currently a researcher. We're supporting her development process, but she created this story called Te Hekenganui, the Great Migration, as a narrative through which she could encourage her community, the people she was meeting with, to talk about the sorts of changes their whānau might need to make, how they might navigate themselves in their whānau. Sorry, whānau is a word for family, extended family. How they might navigate themselves to better health, or Hauora, and to think about who the right people to be leading that process should be, whether it's themselves or other people in the community. And then to identify the long and short-term goals and desires for them and their whānau. So it was based on our own narratives. We left Hawaii as a people because of overpopulation and warfare, and went to find a new place to live, travelling across the Pacific Ocean in waka, which were steered by our chiefs, rangatira, and our scientists, tohunga. And then finally arriving in New Zealand, which was a land of new promise, but a lot colder and a lot more challenging to live in, different food sources and things than the Pacific Islands and where we had come from. And then once arriving in New Zealand, we had to adapt our tikanga, our customs, our protocols, to keep our people safe. And so we asked them to think about how we might be able to use new technologies to meet their own goals for health and well-being. We analysed all our data using the best of qualitative methods. And what came out of our consultation process, I'm focusing here on the Māori, not the Pacific, is that health or hauora for our community is about maintaining a strong connection with family or whānau, to place, our tūranga waiwai, where we come from, and to our whakapapa or our genealogy. And some of the specific themes that came out was this keenness to be able to connect across the generations, older people connecting with younger people, wanting to be able to support, to encourage supportive relationships within those family groupings, strengthening cultural and spiritual identity. A lot of us have lost our spiritual, cultural knowledge, and there's a great desire in our communities to reconnect to that. Strengthening community, connecting with our genealogical stories, our whakapapa, and to our tūranga waiwai. But also they're quite practical. It was also important for our people that they could achieve good health within their financial constraints. And of course everyone wants better futures for the younger generations here. On the left here, I've just shown a Māori health model, Te Whare Tapawhā, which was developed by Sir Mason Jury, who's one of our leading Māori doctors. And it describes the way Māori view health, which is very holistic. And it's based on the fact a house has 4 walls. It needs 4 walls to support it and be strong. And these 4 walls represent the 4 elements of health that are important to Māori. So physical health, taha tinana, spiritual health, taha wairua, mental health, taha hinengaro, and what's the last one? Whānau health, taha whānau, everyone being well together. And it was amazing to see how closely that model related to what our people were saying to us. Anyway, I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running a little late. So based on what we learnt from our communities, we just looked at how we might use mobile health to create a safe, engaging, fun and informative space through technology that supports the cultural aspirations of our people as well as health. So this cultural identity is more important than physical health. So you need that first. We also wanted to build capacity and knowledge for eating healthily and exercising, and coming up with a support that was affordable and accessible for whānau and met the needs of all the community. And we didn't end up finding that a text-based tool would be suitable. What our communities basically said to us was they wanted an app, and we have prototyped now an app that has customisable content, so individuals from different iwis and tribes can put their own material in there, allows people to link with social media platforms, provides suggestions for activity and activities that they could do with their friends and whānau, provides culturally relevant healthy information, allows people to share and add healthy traditional recipes if they want, and has a lot of cultural material in there, so karakia or prayer and whakatoki will be provided for the groups to support activities that they do, but also to be able to share with each other some of that traditional tribal knowledge and stories that were relevant for their own people. And this is just an example of some of the culturally specific information that we might have here. So we use our Māori creation stories here to talk about the different types of foods that were offered by our different gods from our creation stories. And we are now in the process of going on to evaluate that, so we're going to be doing a 3-month randomised controlled trial where our control group will get access to the full app, but they'll just have delayed access. They'll get it after 3 months, and we're looking to recruit about 980 Māori participants from across the country in little whānau clusters, which will be a bit of a challenge so that they can work together and share the tool. And then our outcomes that we're measuring are going to meet the needs of both our funders, researchers, but also it's very important that it meets the needs of our communities. So we'll be measuring changes in self-reported fruit and vegetable activity intake, smoking, alcohol and physical activity for our funders, using the metrics of the app to see how much people are actually using it, the connections that they're making, the challenges they've completed, that sort of thing. But we're also going to measure how it's influenced cultural identity. And so we've developed our own cultural identity tool here based on those health and wellbeing concepts. So hopefully we'll be able to validate that tool as part of this process and use it in future research with other Māori researchers across the country. And I put that in there just to describe the process in case you want to look at my slides later. Okay. So, great. So I'm finished here. So our co-design process really, we felt, empowered our communities to take an active role in the research. They really liked it. They told us things about health and wellbeing that we knew, but we really, it just reaffirmed them to us. And we were able to come up with an app that we think is going to support the healthy lifestyle change through strengthening cultural identity. And we think that's probably the way we should be doing all sorts of research in New Zealand in the future. So a little bit over time, but thank you.
Here's your first question.
So, Māori traditional foods. I think we are a little bit different to you here in that you've got, it's a food basket, and native people have been in this area for many, many years. Whereas we're a migrant population. We've been in New Zealand for 800 years, and we were opportunistic eaters. So the traditional, we had to eat what was there, and there weren't a lot of fruits and vegetables growing there. There were no mammals in New Zealand, so the traditional diet was based a lot on fish and birds. And they brought with them from the islands sweet potatoes, yams, and there was some other root crop. But they could only really be grown in the very far north of the country and were very hard to cultivate. They spent a lot of time and effort trying to cultivate these. So the major starch component of the diet was a fern root, bracken fern root, which took a long time to prepare. I don't think it was very nice. It was very fibrous. It had to be cooked and pounded for hours, and then they'd suck out this starchy stuff, and their teeth didn't cope with that very well. So there's no move back to that fern root because once the settlers came with potatoes and wheat and corn and all sorts of other things, our Māori communities quickly adapted to much nicer and easier to grow foods. We can't eat our native birds because they're all protected. There's not enough of them now, they're very rare. We would still eat fish. So a lot of the traditional foods are actually introduced foods that, post 1800s, I guess. Pork, boil-ups, those sorts of things. Bread. Bread and butter seems a very staple, but it's certainly not traditional at all. So I don't think we would have such a move to return to these foods other than just as sort of novelty foods. But I think what we can do is look at the sorts of macronutrients and nutrients that were supplied by those traditional diets and look for modern day similar sorts of foods, the health values that those foods are giving rather than the actual foods.
Might I just ask you, do you have the Maori equivalent of fry bread that we have here?
Yes, we do. We do. I was a little bit disappointed to see that. Well, not disappointed, but I thought, not the sort of conference to have fry bread, but I would have liked to try it.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. You mentioned one of the determinants of obesity was low food security.
Yeah. One of my ex-colleagues, she's now retired at the University of Otago, really her research area is food security, and she has a questionnaire that she developed as part of her PhD many years ago that was used in our adult nutrition survey to assess food security. And I think there's about 8 different questions that just ask people questions like, have they ever had to rely on family or friends to give them food? Can they always afford to buy the sorts of foods that they want to eat? That sort of thing.
Is the emphasis on money to buy food, or is it just on access to food?
It's on access, actually, which incorporates money there.
Fine. Yeah, thank you. Next question. How much did it cost to create the app, and how many Māori with obesity have access to a smartphone or computer?
Yeah. So we do have a bit of data on access to smartphones and computers, and actually our Māori, we have very high penetration these days, all around the world, I think. smartphones. So a lot of people, probably 87% of the Māori community would have access to a smartphone. And in fact, particularly our younger Māori users are more likely to be using those tools than our non-Māori population. So the one limiting thing is that they may not have access to mobile data, but our tool will be available for people to use on a computer platform as well as a smartphone, and of course you can use Wi-Fi to run that. And we do have a lot of, in our towns and libraries and communities, we have a free Wi-Fi in a lot of places now too. To create the app, the actual research project, the whole project that we're running is over 5 years is costing 2.4 million New Zealand dollars, which is, I think, maybe more like 1.6 million US. But half of that money is being spent on the evaluation. So, and a lot of that will go on salaries and university overhead. So I'm not exactly sure, but we've certainly worked with designers, and we have a app builder as part of our research team as well. So not cheap, but not as expensive as you might think.
2 minutes left.
It's a low-fat diet traditional for Māori. No, I don't think so. I think it would have been probably quite a sort of balanced diet. Probably there hasn't been a lot of research done on it. It would have been quite high in protein, I would think. But as for fats, I think traditional diets, those protein sources that you're eating are not necessarily high in fat. I really think opportunistic eaters there. But what we can tell from some of our writings and paintings from our early settlers is you would often see great big piles of this fern root and dried fish in the paintings, which would suggest that certainly the carbohydrate there, the starchy fern root and the kumara, were important components of the diet alongside the fish protein. And I haven't looked at research on types. Well, we haven't looked at research on types of fat really in that community. Was that time up?
Well, that's good. Yeah. I think that's wonderful response to these questions, Lisa. Can we give Lisa a hand?